Welcome to today's video, where we'll be diving deep into one of the most defining and controversial conflicts of the 20th century, the Vietnam War. For nearly 2 decades, the conflict ravaged Vietnam, but its impacts were felt all around the world. Today, we're going to explore how it began, how it unfolded, and why it left a deep scar in both Vietnam and the United States. We'll look at the causes, key battles, political struggles, and the aftermath of the war, including how it shaped global politics and the way wars are viewed today. To understand the Vietnam War, we must first look back to the early 20th century when Vietnam was a French colony. The French exploited Vietnam's resources, and in the 1940s, during World War II, Japan temporarily took control, making life even more difficult for the Vietnamese people. Amidst this chaos, a nationalist movement led by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh began to gain momentum. After World War II ended, the French attempted to reassert control, but the Vietnamese were determined to fight for independence. In 1946, the First Indochina War broke out between the French and the Viet Minh. This brutal war ended in 1954 with the defeat of the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Following this victory, Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel, with the north controlled by communists under Ho Chi Minh, and the south supported by the West, particularly the United States. The backdrop to the Vietnam War is the Cold War, a global struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, along with their respective allies. The United States, fearing the spread of communism in Asia, supported the South Vietnamese government, even though it was riddled with corruption and instability. President Dwight D. Eisenhower promoted the domino theory, suggesting that if Vietnam fell to communism, other countries in Southeast Asia would follow suit, like a row of falling dominoes. In the early 1960s, under President John F. Kennedy, American involvement increased. The U.S. began sending military advisors to South Vietnam, and the situation quickly escalated into a proxy war between the U.S. and communist forces backed by the Soviet Union and China. The turning point came in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where U.S. naval ships reportedly came under attack by North Vietnamese forces. This event led to Congress passing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave President Lyndon B. Johnson the authority to escalate U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. By 1965, President Johnson had committed ground troops to Vietnam. The war quickly escalated, with the U.S. bombing North Vietnam and launching ground assaults against the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army in the south. The Vietnam War became a brutal, guerrilla conflict, with the U.S. military struggling to combat an enemy that knew the terrain and used unconventional tactics. Napalm, Agent Orange, and other chemical defoliants became infamous in the war, as the U.S. military tried to clear the dense jungles that were perfect cover for the Viet Cong. But these tactics had devastating consequences for both the environment and the civilian population. As the war dragged on, opposition to the conflict grew, especially in the United States. Young Americans, including students and civil rights activists, began to speak out against the war. The anti-war movement gained momentum, organizing large protests and demonstrations. One of the most significant moments came in 1968 during the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where anti-war protests clashed with police. And in 1970, the tragic Kent State shootings, where National Guardsmen killed 4 students during a protest, sparked national outrage and deepened divisions over the war. 1968 marked a critical turning point in the war. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, a coordinated series of attacks on South Vietnamese cities during the Lunar New Year. Despite the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces ultimately repelling the attack, it was a psychological blow. The scale and surprise of the offensive shattered the illusion that victory was near. The Tet Offensive was a turning point in American public opinion. Even respected figures, like CBS anchor Walter Cronkite, began questioning the U.S. government's optimism about the war, broadcasting doubts to millions of Americans. By 1969, Richard Nixon had become president. He promised to end the war with what he called peace with honor, and began a policy of Vietnamization, which aimed to transfer the responsibility for fighting the war to the South Vietnamese while gradually withdrawing U.S. troops. Despite the withdrawal of U.S. troops, Nixon expanded the war into neighboring Cambodia and Laos in an attempt to target Viet Cong supply lines. This provoked even more protests and further eroded public support for the war. The war officially ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. North Vietnamese forces captured the city, and Vietnam was reunified under communist rule. The human cost of the war was staggering. Over 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese were killed. The war left Vietnam deeply scarred, with entire regions of the country devastated. The U.S. also faced a deep reckoning, as the war led to the loss of faith in government institutions and a lasting legacy of political division. Today, the Vietnam War remains a painful chapter in both American and Vietnamese history. It changed how the U.S. approaches foreign policy, leading to more caution in military interventions. In Vietnam, the war left a legacy of trauma, but also a resilient population determined to rebuild. Though the U.S. and Vietnam once stood as adversaries, today, the two countries have diplomatic and economic ties. The war, however, remains a stark reminder of the costs of military intervention, and its lessons continue to resonate globally. The Vietnam War, often called the American War in Vietnam, reshaped the global order and left scars that are still healing. It serves as a potent reminder of the complexities of war and the enduring impact of foreign intervention. Thank you for watching this in-depth exploration of the Vietnam War. We hope it helped you understand the broader implications of this conflict. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more historical content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or questions about the war, and we'll see you next time.